Revelation chapter 17, and if you would also get your bulletin and have it open to the front. We're moving forward this morning in a little bit of a different direction. Normally the choir would be singing. They're going to sing in a moment in preparing us for the Lord's table. I'll give you a moment to find your place in Revelation 17 and 18. I ask you to look up here when you find your place. Like you, I am growing weary of reading and listening to God's judgment, God's wrath, and His punishment for sin week after week, chapter after chapter, verse after verse. In fact, I'm going to share with you, she said I could. I was speaking with Melissa about it over the weekend in preparation, and she said, when are you ever going to be done with Revelation? I'm tired of hearing this. And so I just want you to know that I'm in the boat with you and others. We're all tired of hearing this. It's like eating salad every day. We know it's good for our bodies, but there's a part of us that just wants to take those vegetables out of the salad, throw some batter on them, and fry them. Because it just tastes better fried. Everything tastes better fried. Fried okra, fried squash, even French fried green beans. And so it is with the book of Revelation. We know that our spiritual diet ultimately benefits from hearing and understanding and appreciating the judgment of God against sin and Satan. But there's a part of us that just wants to take these chapters and these verses, maybe even the entire book of Revelation, and throw it into some type of new interpretation so that it sits better on our ears, that it sits better on our stomachs. Maybe like eating our vegetables, we just choose not to include the book of Revelation in our diet at all. I use that little illustration as a way of trying to lighten the mood, because if I were totally honest with you, I did not want to preach from Revelation 17 or 18 today. In fact, I thought about just throwing these chapters out of this series. I know some of you are thinking, well, why didn't you? Skipping to chapter 19, as Elisa and I talked about the music for this series several months ago, there were moments as we were kind of looking at this whole book, and we were kind of looking at each other as if to say, what do we sing that week? I mean, think about it. There's not a single hymn that was inspired by John's vision of a great prostitute. The great city of Babylon being completely destroyed in a day. So because I'm not skipping over these chapters, I'm grateful that Elisa has chosen to balance our spiritual diet today with these wonderful songs that we've been singing about Jesus and His precious and sweet name. That being said, however, it's time for us to face the music. It's time for us to turn our attention one last time, I promise you, one last time, to a final wake-up call given by God to His people, both in the first century and in the 21st century, in the book of Revelation. There's a wonderful book written by C.J. Mahaney called Worldliness, Resisting the Seduction of a Fallen World, and in it he says this: today the greatest challenge facing Bible-believing American Christians is not persecution from the world, but seduction by the world. Charles Spurgeon, the Prince of Preachers, once said this in response to his day and age, and I believe it applies to us today. He said, I believe that one reason why the Church of God at this present moment has such little influence over the world is because the world has so much influence over the church. Put your finger on any prosperous page in the church's history, and you'll find a little marginal note that says, in this age, people could readily see where the church began and where the world ended. The reality for you and me is that we live in a day where we cannot tell the difference between where the world ends and the church begins. Study after study after study shows that our lifestyles, those of us in this room, our lifestyles as professing Christians looks just like the world around us. We're just as materialistic, just as sexually immoral, and just as self-centered as the world. I didn't want to preach that this morning. Our spending patterns are strikingly similar to the world around us. Our giving patterns are strikingly similar to the world around us. The percentage of professing Christian men who view pornography is virtually the same as non-Christian men. Sexual activity with someone who's not your spouse, whether you're single or you're married, is almost just as common among Christians as it is non-Christians. And in marriages, we're just as likely to divorce as non-Christians. In fact, some studies have even shown that divorce is more common among professing Christians than non-Christians. Other studies show that marital abuse is just as common in our homes as in the homes of non-believers. And as we talk about parenting, and as we think about raising families and children, the priorities of professing Christian parents for their kids look very similar, if not identical, to the priorities of non-Christian parents. We cart our kids all over town in the same way that non-Christian parents do, teaching our kids to be good at the things in this world that are most important, things like sports and entertainment, because that's what the world says is important. And it's not always what our kids are getting that's bad, it's what our kids aren't getting that's what's bad. They spend hours in practice, hours in front of the TV with video games, and a minute at the most in the Word of God or in prayer with their parents. One of the statistics that I found as I was preparing for this is that 60 to 90% of our kids will leave their faith by the time that they are 18 years old. Let's make this easy and let's just take the middle of that and say 75%. If you have 4 children, 3 of the 4 will no longer have faith in Christ, will no longer exercise their faith and their religion by the time that they're 18. Is this acceptable to us? Something's got to change. We're living just like the world. We look just like the world. Those of us here today love this world. As 1 John 2:15, as Elisa read earlier, says, do not love the world or the things of this world. That's on the front of your bulletin. Now, there are a lot of things that this verse doesn't mean. It doesn't mean don't love the people of the world. We know, John 3:16, that God loved the world so much that He gave His one and only Son to die for the people of the world. That's not what John is saying. What John is saying here is that we must not love the ways and the practices of the world that alienate them from God and in so many ways are even against God. A world that goes on day by day with people gratifying themselves and indulging themselves and entertaining themselves and exalting themselves without regard for God at all. That's what John is talking about in 1 John 2:15. John is saying the church should look different. Our schedules should look different. Our spending should look different. Our marriages should look different. Our parenting, our purity, our possessions, our love, our lives should look different from the rest of the world, and not just for the sake of being different, but because we love God more than we love the world. Do our lives look different because we love God, or do our lives look different because, well, we're just supposed to be different? Do we love God more than we love the world? He says right here after this in 1 John chapter 2 on the front of your bulletin, if anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. And this is key. John says, worldliness is not a matter of externals. As if, don't do that and do this and add that to your life. Worldliness is a problem of the heart. Listen to what he says next. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes and pride of life, these are things that are not inside of us. John says they're not from the Father, but from the world. And then he closes with this warning. John says, the world is passing away along with its desires, but whoever does the will of God abides forever. Now, the reason that I've started here today is because that 1 John chapter 2, verses 15, 16, and 17 is exactly what Revelation 17 and 18 is all about. We have struggled over these many weeks to understand what John is seeing in these visions in Revelation. And what you read in 1 John 2, 15, 16, and 17 is put into a pictorial version in Revelation 17 and 18. He wrote it down for the churches and for Christians who are being deceived by worldliness, to Christians whose lives are looking just like the world. And John is saying, don't love the world or the things of this world. They will destroy you. And this is the word that we need to hear. No, this is a word I need to hear. Whether you hear it or not, I don't know. It's a word I need to hear today. And so though I didn't want to preach from Revelation 17 and 18, I feel compelled to do so. So what I'm going to do today is to go simply and poignantly and briefly through Revelation 17 and 18, which is basically, again, this illustration, this pictorial version of what you just read. Then the choir will sing for us and prepare us for the Lord's table. This has been so humbling for me because I see worldliness in many of my own thoughts, in many of my own affections and practices. I'm not saying this is what's wrong with you. I'm saying I see this in my life. Now over to Revelation 17. We're not going to read all of 17 or 18. There are two questions that I want us to walk through quickly. The first question is this: what's going on here in Revelation 17 and 18? It's a vision that an angel shows to John of a great prostitute sitting on a scarlet beast. And this vision is an expansion of what we saw last week in the bowls of God's wrath. In fact, the angel who here is showing John this vision is the one that's holding the seven bowls, reveals this to him, so it's definitely connected to what we saw last week. And there are two main characters and two main actions that take place in Revelation 17 and 18. The first character is an attractive woman who symbolizes worldly seduction. She may not seem attractive because she's sitting on a beast, but the introduction to her in verse 4, where she's arrayed in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, and the image of a prostitute are intended to evoke a picture of seduction. She draws people to herself. Even John, in a sense, is awestruck by her in verse 6. He marvels at this vision. There's a lot going on behind that marveling, but at least a part of it is how attractive this woman is. John tells us in verse 18 that she's symbolic of the great city of Babylon. We've seen Babylon once already back in chapter 14, but there Babylon is much more prevalent as a picture of worldly desires and worldly wealth and worldly pleasure and worldly fame. This goes all the way back, if you might recall, to Genesis and the Tower of Babel, from whence Babylon came, and the people and the nation of Babylon attacking and destroying God's people in Jerusalem, his city. And now here in Revelation, it's almost certain a symbol of Rome and all its luxuries and all of its pleasures and economic prosperity that was seducing the nations in the world, including the church and the first century believers. And in this way, Babylon stands for worldly ways throughout all of history that have pulled the world and even us as the church away from God. The image of the prostitute, though it includes sexual immorality, is not just about sexual immorality. So when you see prostitute, I know our minds go there in regards to sexuality, but that's not all that it's about. Ultimately, this image of a prostitute is a symbol of infidelity. It's similar to an image all across the Bible of God's people going away from Him. If you've ever read the Old Testament prophet Hosea, who's told to go and marry a prostitute, the whole purpose of God telling him to do that was to show the people, this is what you are like with me. You go away from me all the time. You're unfaithful to me. It's powerful, poignant, gripping imagery symbolizing the tendency of all of our hearts to leave our God, to run after love for this world. So we have an attractive woman who symbolizes worldly seduction, and she's sitting on a beast that symbolizes worldly persecution. We've already seen this imagery of the beast back in chapter 13, a symbol of a government that functions, albeit as a counterfeit God. And so here we see the social and economic and societal ways of the world cooperating in conjunction with politics and structures in this world. And this beast has 7 heads, symbolizing 7 mountains and 7 kings, as John explains in the middle of that chapter, chapter 17. Images of strength and power. Some say refer to 7 Roman emperors. Others say refer to 7 empires that have come or are coming, leading up to the return of Christ. There's almost certainly a reference in some way here to Rome and its worldly authority during the first century that was being imposed in many ways on the Christians of that day, including their persecution. And yet it also might stand for states and empires to come throughout the world, from this time even now into the future, and stand for a nation and empire that will come to persecute Christians. So we've got this twofold picture in Revelation 17, a picture of seduction by the world in the picture and the image of the woman, and persecution from the world in the image of the beast. And now as this vision progresses, we see 2 particular actions that take place. The first one is at the end of chapter 17. The woman is devoured by the beast. In graphic imagery, the beast turns on the woman, making her desolate and devouring her flesh and burning her with fire. The picture of an ungodly world system that literally turns on itself, destroying itself. And John says that this happens according to the purpose of God. Revelation 17, verse 17. For God has put it into their hearts to carry out His purpose. According to the words of God, this will happen. God's sovereignty, once again, being on display. We've talked about that week after week. God is still in control. He's still sovereign amidst all of this. And because of this, ultimately, the woman disappears from the earth. That's the second action that we see take place. And that's what chapter 18 is all about. Babylon falls. We see the smoke of her burning, rising up. And in Revelation 18:21, an angel takes a millstone and casts it into the sea and says, "So will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence and will be found no more." And this happens as a result of the judgment of God. So that's what's going on in chapter 17 and 18, a pictorial version of 1 John 2:15 through 17. By the way, you might want to just make a note. The same John that wrote 1 John 2:15 to 17 is the same John that received these visions. Same guy. So now the second question. What does this mean for you and for me? What does all this have to do with life in good old Greenville County, Landrum, at the Cliffs at Glassy? Well, think about what we learn in these visions about the world. We learn that this world is full of deceptive attractions. Part of what John marveled at in chapter 17 was this alluring picture of what seemed like pleasure and strength and power and almost certainly first century Christians would have looked at the strength of Rome and the luxuries of Rome and the pleasures of Rome and thought, is this so bad? This looks pretty good. The roads that are in place and the prosperity and the trade and the wealth of Rome, is this really all that bad? And similarly today, you and I have a tendency to look at wealth and technology and the things around us and think, are these things so bad? Think about the lures of this world, regaining your youth, sensual pleasure, material possessions, splendor and music and dancing and perceived prosperity and beauty and worldly delight. Is this not what entices us? Think of the commercials that you see. Think of the ways in which they speak to you. Is this not why we treat marriage so flippantly? Is this not why our parenting looks the same as the world around us? Is this not why we don't tithe? Because we desire the stuff of this world and the splendors and the pleasures of this world more than we desire the will of God in our lives and seeing the gospel being proclaimed throughout the world? Maybe it's the insatiable lust for power as spoken of in Revelation chapter 18 and verse 7. The woman says, I sit as a queen, I am no widow, and mourning I shall never see. Prostitute claiming to be a queen, thinking that she's mighty when in fact she's not. We climb the corporate ladder, we achieve cultural success, we think we've arrived, we've made it, look at us, but we have no clue as to the depth of our true place and position. And that's just it. At the root of all of this is the subtle lure of pride. Verse 7 of chapter 18, she glorifies herself. The theme that dominates these two chapters, pride. She sees herself not just as a prostitute, but as a great prostitute in verse 1. Babylon the Great, verse 5 of chapter 17. She's the great city, Revelation 17, verse 18. Babylon the Great, Revelation 18, 2. The great city, 18, verses 10, 16, 19. It's not just being something, it's being greater than. The lure of pride. At the root of all these worldly desires is the priority of ourselves. And we see the world that's headed to a definite conclusion. Not only do we learn that it's deceptive, but it's headed for a conclusion. It's fallen. Though Rome at the time is still standing around them, God says it's fallen. Though the power and prestige of our culture and our country and our world is still standing today, brothers and sisters, our world is falling. It's a guaranteed reality. This world will be destroyed completely and suddenly. Look at this list at the end of chapter 18, beginning in verse 22. One day there's no more music, there's no more craft, there's no more work, there's no more light, there's no more joy, complete destruction. Our recent flooding event here at the church reminded us of this reality. One day this place, this wonderful sanctuary that we love and that we adore and that we feel at home in, will burn up or flood or fall over because this world will be destroyed. May we not put our hope in our homes. May we not put our security in our portfolios. May we put our hope in God. And that leads us to what we learn about sin and Satan in these verses. Sin is self-destructive and eventually damning. Is there any clearer picture of the self-destructive nature of sin than this woman being devoured by the beast on which she sits? This world will eventually turn on itself according to the purpose of God, and God will make clear that sin always destroys. Always. I want you to listen to the words of Proverbs 7 now that we've talked a little bit about Revelation 17. Listen to this description of a man going after a prostitute and see a picture of our lives. running after the ways and the things of this world. The writer of Proverbs said, "For at the window of my house I have looked out through my lattice, and I've seen among the simple, I have perceived among the youths a young man lacking sense, passing along the street near her corner, taking the road to her house in the twilight, in the evening, at the time of night and darkness. And behold, the woman meets him, dressed as a prostitute, wily of heart. She's loud and wayward, her feet do not stay at home, now in the street, now in the market, and at every corner she lies in wait. She seizes him and kisses him, and with bold face she says to him, I had to offer sacrifices, and today I have paid my vows. So now I have come out to meet you, to seek you eagerly, and I have found you. I have spread my couch with coverings, colored linens from Egyptian linen. I've perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. Come, let us take our fill of love till morning. Let us delight ourselves with love, for my husband is not at home. He's gone on a long journey. He took a bag of money with him. At full moon he will come home. And with much seductive speech she pursued him. With her smooth talk she compels him. All at once he follows her as an ox goes to the slaughter, and as a stag is caught fast till an arrow pierces its liver. As a bird rushes into a snare, he does not know that it will cost him his life. And now, O sons, listen to me and be attentive to the words of my mouth. Let not your heart turn aside to her ways. Do not stray into her paths, for many a victim has she laid low, and all her slain are a mighty throng. Her house is the way to Sheol, to the grave, to hell, going down to the chambers of death. Oh, that we would hear the gracious warning of God this morning. The ways of this world lead to death. But in the middle of all of this, see what we learn about Jesus. Revelation 17 and verse 14, the conquering Lamb, the Lord of lords and the King of kings, and by His overcoming grace, He calls you and me to be saved. Those with Him in verse 14 are called. They are chosen. They are His. Jesus calls us to Himself, and for all of us who are in Him, for Christians with His overcoming power, He calls us not only to be saved, but to be faithful. Revelation 18 verse 4, talking about the woman, He says to His people, come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues. God is pictured as pleading for His people to turn from the ways of the world before it's too late. And that leads us to what we learn about ourselves. What does all of this mean for you and me? Very clearly, love for the world and love for God cannot coexist. Here's the way this works. It's simple. Love for the world pushes out love for God. If we love the ways of the world and if we love the world, God will be pushed aside. The more we nibble at the table of this world and the things of this world, the more our hearts will become numb towards the love of God. Do we wonder why we have no hunger in our day for God? It's because we've nibbled at the table of the world and we've pushed God away. But the reverse is also true. The more we love God, the less the world will have such a hold on us. The more we love God, the more we delight in Him, the more we commune with Him, the less we love this world. The more that we see God as infinitely pleasurable, the more we see God as our supreme possession, the less we'll run after the pleasures and the possessions of this world. Don't miss this. The call to turn away from the world is not a call to a drab, dull, dreary life. C.S. Lewis said this in his book, The Weight of Glory. We are half-hearted creatures, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy has been offered to us. Like an ignorant child who goes on making mud pies in the slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offering of a holiday at the sea. We are far too easily pleased. Folks, if you're turning aside from your spouse, if you're holding and indulging pornography, if you're casual with sex, if you're thinking and climbing the corporate ladder and achieving worldly aims, whether in your life or in your children and grandchildren's lives, thinking that that's the end of life in all of these things, if we think that another home or more cars will make us happy in all these things, our problem is not that we desire pleasure too much, it's that we desire it too little. We're playing with mud pies in a slum when God has offered to us so much more in Him. May we turn aside from the ways of the world. Last, we have a choice. Either we can love the things of this world, forever be chasing that which will be passing away, money and possessions and even family, or we can love the God who reigns supreme over this world and over everything that will pass away. We can love the God who alone can satisfy. And if we take this option, our pleasure will be unfading and our security will be in heaven. Pray with me.